Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the kind invitation to come here. This is an overview of the issues I'd like to touch upon today. And really what I'm trying to do is, rather than going into details on the science, to step back a little bit and look at the importance of soil for society in general and for helping to solve some of the biggest problems that we face today. So I'm going to start off with a quick overview of the reality. We are really living through a time of constant change, of disruption. And governments at international level, at national level, and at regional level are really struggling to cope with what's being demanded of them in terms of having a plan and in terms of implementing it. And the soil fits into this whole program. I'll look a little bit at the long-term vision for rural areas. There's a thing called the Soil Mission, and I want to connect that with one of the most important problems of food security, I would say, and that is the incomes of farmers. Because people are leaving agriculture. There are better things to do where they get better paid, and it's a real threat to our food security. And then what I'm going to spend most of the time is discussing the carbon markets, because there's a lot of stuff going on. One of the functions of the soil is to sequester carbon, and there's a lot of other work going on in other domains on carbon sequestration. And people who work in finance consider that this is going to be one of the biggest economic sectors of the future. Hundreds of billions of euros a year being tied up in carbon projects and the trading of carbon, etc. And again, agriculture can be a part of that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, how people working in agriculture and rural development could try to capitalize on this and transform rural economies as a result. So the first thing is just a reminder, that terrible things are happening right now. We've ignored it for a long time. We knew about the role of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for 300 years. We've known about this. Even Toyota started working on the climate in 1963. And we're still dragging our heels, being held back by vested interests, etc. And now we're in a really difficult situation where we have extreme wildfires, drought, and also people dying from heat stress. Now, I was doing some work in India recently. In February, I was in an investment meeting in Lucknow. And just by accident, after I came back, I read a book called The Ministry of the Future, which is a wonderful book. I recommend it to everybody. And it does near future scenarios about how the climate crisis might evolve. And the opening scene was in Lucknow. It was about what's called wet bulb events and how millions of people die from heat stress as a result of these wet bulb events. And just recently in the newspapers, we've been hearing about people allegedly dying from heat stress in Lucknow. And not only in India, also in Europe. We've had these heat waves in Europe, and hundreds of people have already died so far.
In British Columbia.
Sorry?
In British Columbia, over 200 people.
Indeed, it's a global phenomenon, actually, yeah. And if you look at one event, you might say, it's just an exception. Forget about it, because we have lots of people in the news telling us the climate is not in crisis. It damn well is in crisis, and we need to act. And as a result of this, we have an increase in activism, and even violent activism, etc., and governments in serious crisis as a result of this. So just a quick reminder that any work you do in the soil, in the back of your mind, you're really making a contribution to these bigger and increasingly urgent problems. That's just a recent picture from India. And at the beginning of COVID, Unilever had to come up with a strategy to deal with the huge disturbance to the food and other commodity markets that COVID provoked. And in doing so, they tried to look at, what are the other shocks that are coming down the line that we will have to respond to that will have an impact on our supply chains. And so look at COVID, which is actually a sequence of many, many waves. It's only represented by 1 year. And the recession, dealing with this, where's the money going to come from? We've had terrible problems with businesses going bust, etc., and people not being able to pay their rent, and now not being able to pay for the heating, and making choices between whether we eat or whether we heat in the winter time. So this is the recession scenario which we're already living through and which will get worse. Climate change, spoke about that already, the heat stress phenomenon and other things, but the biggest one of the lot is the threat of biodiversity collapse. And again, the soil has an important role to play here, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. But the point is that the revision of the Common Agricultural Policy, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, all of these things are all working towards solutions for the problems that we face. And one of the things that we're being asked to solve so many problems now at once that we can't find the money. The Commission had to go to the bond market to get the money for the Recovery Fund, the 800 billion, extra billion in the Recovery Fund. And then in giving the Recovery Fund to the Member States, it says, and by the way, the money we give you is only 1/3 of the budget. You have to come up with 2/3 someplace else. And so Belgium, for example, has done green bonds. They raised about 10 billion euros on the green bond market. And the funny thing about it is that it's investors in Russia and China and Saudi Arabia, not just in Latin America, that are financing the transition in Europe. So when you talk about geopolitics, bear in mind that all of these guys are helping us in our transition, etc. But what it means now is that local government, and it is local government, because local governments have to design the solutions, they have to come up with a policy response, and increasingly they have to find the money to implement the measures, etc. So this is the situation we're living in. It means that in parallel with all of the really important work that needs to be done on soil science and the biology of natural environments, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on innovative finance and in governance and on the transformation of local government. Because government has a really important role to play in all of this. And without the guiding hand of government, it's going to be chaos and we will not solve the problems we have to solve. Anyway, in terms of dealing with these things, the cities have been organized for a while, and there's a thing called the Covenant of Mayors, but the rural regions have been left out of the equation. They were ignored. Until recently, we now have something called the long-term vision for rural areas. So it's very recent. It's the first time at EU level we have a vision for the future of the rural areas. Before that, we treated the rural areas as a place where we kept the farmers. They had to produce food. We gave them a little bit of money so they could survive. And then all of the action was in the cities. But now we have a vision for the rural areas. And the deadlines are 2040. And by 2040, the vision is that the rural areas are strong. That means they have a voice in policy, they're setting policy proactively, etc. They're a part of the management of the whole country and the whole of Europe. And they're neglected until now, by and large. They're connected, not only connected by internet, but also by road and train, etc., and in other ways, which we'll come to, resilient, and the big thing is prosperous. Now the rural regions are considered fully developed economies. It's not just about farming and forestry. It's also about energy and transport and innovation and the circular bioeconomy and everything else. So this has only been on the policy agenda now for about 2 years. So it's very early days, but it means finally at the highest level in Europe, the rural regions, we have a vision for it. But in the meetings of the Commission, the commissioners and the guys, the Committee of the Regions and all of these big organizations, what they say is that the rural regions at local level, you have to start setting the agenda. Don't wait for the guys above to decide it for you because they're overwhelmed. They just can't do it. You have to take responsibility for your own future. Again, it's putting pressure on the regions, and it means that they have to learn to work and think and operate in ways that they're not familiar with, that are quite different from business as usual. And I want to come to this farm prosperity thing. Because I grew up on a farm. So I know what farm life is like. I have cousins who are still farming. One of them is quite a successful beef farmer. But ultimately, he's in poverty. he's lucky that his wife is a film director and she's quite successful, making a lot of money, so the family lives well. But if the family had to survive on beef farming, they'd be doing very badly indeed. And the hilarious thing, hilarious in inverted commas, is that if you want to buy meat in a shop, you really pay a ridiculous price for it. It just gets more and more expensive every day, and nobody knows where the money is going because it is not going into the pockets of the farmers. There's a guy called Matt Stoller in the US, and he looks at industrial concentration. And this is, a wonderful diagram that he created where he compares the evolution of the price that a farmer gets for a pound of beef and the price that a consumer pays for a pound of beef. And so he does a little bit of sleight of hand, to align the graphs, etc. But basically the two prices, what the farmer gets and the consumer pays, they advance in lockstep up until around here, about 2015, and then they diverge quite radically. And the farmer gets less and less, and the consumer has to pay more and more. And ultimately, that's a sign of industrial concentration. So the abattoirs and the beef processors, etc., and the retailers, these are the guys that are making the profits. And because of the concentration, they squeeze the farmers and they get less and less. Now, I've tried to get figures in Europe, and similar diagrams, you can get them in Europe, etc. But this is the most spectacular and easiest to read one. It happens to be based on American data. But it's an excellent illustration of the problem of prosperity in rural areas and the problem of prosperity for farmers. I'm reassured by economists working on agriculture in Europe that you can come up with similar diagrams for almost any agricultural commodity across Europe. Now, in Ireland, the farmers have tried to take the meat packers to court over this, but they never win. And you can't win, because the farmers cannot afford the big lawyers, etc. This is not a game that you can win against the lawyers, because the game is always drag it out, appeal, drag it out, appeal, make the others incur greater and greater costs and kick the can down the road. So if you're small, you can never win this game, and the big corporate interests are always well in a good position to actually win that. But there are other things you can do. This is the reality of the situation, but in the work that I've been doing over the years, I've come across all kinds of amazing models where the farmers can win and get paid a fair price, etc. And they can work around this. Now, the reason I mention it is I would hate in 10 years' time to be looking at a similar diagram where we're not talking about the price of beef, but the price of carbon. And it's already happening in energy. I've been doing some work on biofuels in India. It's government policy, all of the work on biofuels, the farmers have to benefit from it. And so the policy papers are, we want the biofuel revolution in India to double the incomes of the farmers. And for those who are involved in it, it has not only doubled, in some cases it has tripled their incomes. It's having a huge impact on the farmers in India. And it's a kind of a social revolution that's going on that not many talk about or even know about, but it's real. In Europe, I was looking at attending some circular bioeconomy meetings, and again, just coming back to one case, the case of Ireland, a lot of the circular bioeconomy strategies are based around farm waste. So I asked them, okay, you have all of this new business, selling energy into the grid, into the market, a new entrepreneurial effort, etc. But how much are the farmers getting for the waste? And they tell me, no, they give it for free. Farmers are getting nothing out of this. So I think we're in a moment, because of all of these crises, the crisis moment is the moment where you can make lots of changes in general. But this is a moment where we really need to change the model of the rural economy and the models under which farmers operate. Now, we all know about soils. Well, I don't, but you guys do. You're excellent research scientists, etc. So this is just a quick recap on the multifunctionality of soil. Within the European model, the main purpose of the soil is to produce food. And we've been very good at teaching farmers to farm in a certain way so that they are productive. and increasingly productive. They'll produce, we're not going to pay them more, but they're going to produce more, etc. This is the game as it has happened over the years. But they also provide all kinds of other services. I mean, the water directive in Europe has a huge impact on farming, and it's an acknowledgement that farmers make a huge contribution to the availability of potable water in cities, for example. But this is a service that should be paid for, because if you don't get potable water, you have to purify it at great cost, energy cost, and a great commercial cost, and pipe it around, etc., etc. Already in the US, some of the big cities like New York, they are paying farmers and putting money into the rural communities because of the water services they provide. So the point I'm making is that there's a lot of services that farming and agriculture and rural areas actually provide, which could and should be paid for. But we haven't been paying attention to this. And generally, we impose upon the farmers to do things in a certain way. And then if they do that in a certain way, we give them a minimum amount of money through the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, etc. And somehow, this needs to be adjusted. I don't have the total answer to it. I think this is something that, will evolve in the years to come. But everything, I'm going to spend most of the time on carbon, but everything I'm saying about carbon also applies to water. It also applies to biodiversity, etc. And even in terms of the productive capacity, come back to the beef diagram there. Farmers are not getting fairly paid for what they do. They should be. And there are ways to ensure that they can get better paid. But these need to be systematically developed. Now, since we're on soils, I just want to point out that we tend to put the focus on farming because we're coming from a logic of food security, but there's also forestry and recently the nature reserves. Just yesterday it was announced that after a big struggle, the new legislation on biodiversity has been passed. Ursula von der Leyen had a big struggle in her own team was abandoning ship and wasn't even supporting it, but eventually she dragged them back in line, and it looks as though we have the okay for the legislation, which requires that 20% of all natural habitats on land and on the sea in Europe are wilded by 2030 at the latest. 2030 is not so far away. Now, we can go into more detail on this in terms of the restoration of wetlands, and there are lots and lots of targets, etc. But these targets are getting more and more ambitious. They're causing huge political strife, and there are real question marks as to our ability to deliver on those targets. And this is one of the things, I'm a member of the Club of Rome, it's one of the things that we're discussing a lot nowadays in the Club of Rome. But the point is that beside and in addition to all of the good science on the biology of soils and ecology, etc., we need to look at the overall economic models for managing the planet. And you can't do this in isolation. In other words, if we just have excellence in soil science and don't pay attention to these other issues, we're not going to achieve our goals. We will not have a sustainable planet. And certainly the prosperity of rural areas, all the money will be sucked out of it. It will go into private equity, it'll go into financial institutions, big industry, etc. And very little of it will remain with the communities that have provided all of these goods. So now, we've all heard about carbon markets, do you follow this in detail? Do you wake up every morning, the first thing you do, you look at the price of carbon, after you've looked at the price of Bitcoin or something like that? Probably not. But let's dwell on this a little bit, because this new soil economy is related to this, and ultimately it comes back to the same thing, carbon credits. And so carbon credits are created in lots of different types of markets. And one of the reasons the financial industry loves this is that they see, I'll buy it up where it's cheap here, buy the credits, hold it. and then I'll sell them later when the price is right. You know, they're looking at opportunity not only to own the credits themselves, but to practice arbitrage and to get the highest price for it, etc., and ultimately hold back progress. So there's a dynamic going on. If you're focusing on farming and ecology, etc., there's a whole dynamic going on in the economics of financial and commodities markets, etc., which you really need to know about, and which will have an impact on the kind of the business models that you employ in developing these ideas going forward. Now, the European trading system is one of more than 50 regulated carbon exchanges around the world. And the number of exchanges is increasing. It's the biggest, the most important, and in a sense, the pioneering one. And it's modeled on a concept called cap and trade. Now, do you remember in the 1980s, everybody was afraid of acid rain, you know? Like if you didn't have an umbrella, the rain fell in your head, you'd lose your hair or something like that. The rain was polluted by sulfurs and nitrates, etc., from the factories, falling on the mountains into the lakes, killing the fish, killing the trees, etc. And it was a real problem. But nobody talks about it now. The reason is because the problem has more or less been solved. And the mechanism was this cap and trade mechanism, where you give a permit to the sinners, and you say, okay, so you produce so much pollution. Today we'll allow you, we'll give you a permit for that pollution, okay, and it costs nothing. So you're allowed to pollute today, but you have until next year now. You need to renew the permit, but it'll have a price. And so you can innovate and change what you do and reduce your need for permits. And if you have an excess of permits, you can sell them into the market. So the quicker you innovate, the better. You could make extra money by selling off the permits. And then if you need extra permits, you're going to have to buy them off the market. So this idea of measuring how much everybody pollutes, giving them some permits, and then managing the price of those permits over time, forcing people to innovate against the price of permits, etc. This is the cap and trade system. And it actually worked very well in the case of acid rain. And so this is why the Commission, has set up the ETS system in Europe. And of course, people complain. Some people say this is a bad idea because you're allowing the baddies to do the bad thing. But you have to give them a pathway, to doing the good thing that's feasible. You can't throw them in jail or wag the finger and send them to hell. Some people in these arguments are incredibly ideological and they want miracles. They don't deal with the realities of business or human nature. But the cap and trade system is something that tries to accommodate the fact that people will cheat if they can. They'll do the right thing only at the lowest cost, or as late as possible. And this gives them a mechanism where they have initially gentle reminders and then stiffer and stiffer penalties for doing the wrong thing over time. And so for many, many years, the price of carbon credit on this kind of a market was around like 2 euros, 5 euros. It was very low, and everybody said it's far too low. But now it's up around 100 euros. And so for 1 ton, a credit is 1 ton of carbon emitted. To buy a permit to emit that 1 ton, you're going to have to pay $100 or 100 euros, whatever the currency is. Now, over time, the credits are no longer free. Initially, they were given free. They're no longer free anymore. And from 2026, the shipping industry and the airlines industry, they get no discounts. They have to pay the full price for the credits according to the market. So if I'm a shipping company and I emit, 100,000 tons of carbon in a year, that's 100,000 times the price in the market, which today is $100 a ton. It could be $1,000 a ton at some time in the future. So this is the pressure that industry is under now to buy carbon credits or to change their business so they emit less. So they have fewer credits that they need to pay for through the market. Now, the ETS system has recently been revised and it's being copied around the world. And now there's a discussion about having an international cost of carbon as well, because they're all individual markets. And if you're in one market, you can't trade on the other because the price is lower. But anyway, this is stuff, background noise. If you read about it in the paper, maybe you know a little bit more about what's going on. But the question is, how do you reduce your carbon footprint? And there are a few things you can do. One is to use renewable energy, whether it's wind or solar or biofuels or hydrogen or whatever. Another is you can increase your efficiency. And usually that means an engineering project that's very expensive. And the third thing is carbon sequestration. And the carbon sequestration usually means that you buy a credit that's sold to you by what's called a carbon project. So in the past, somebody would grow trees. And I'll tell you about the projects later. They grow trees, and the trees suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And then you can buy a credit, pay them for doing this. Because if they sequester a ton of carbon in tree matter, then you have an argument to say that I didn't extract the carbon or reduce the carbon myself, but I paid for somebody else to do it. So this is the idea of the carbon credits. But the International Energy Agency is adamant, you need to do all of these things at the same time. You can't just do renewables, or efficiency, or carbon sequestration. All of those three things have to happen at once, and they need to happen now. But the point is that you can only grow so many trees. If you run the numbers, there's only room on Earth for so many trees. And it's not enough to sequester all of the carbon that needs to be sequestered to reach net zero in 2050. There are other options. One is sequestering in the soil, and there's a huge potential there. But it's something that we've only really started looking at properly recently. Another is what's called direct air capture. Now this machine, do you recognize it? Have you seen it in the news? It's from a project in Iceland called Orca that's run by a company called Climeworks, which is a brainchild of Bill Gates. So this machine, it cost about somewhere between $10 and $15 million to build. And if it runs at full capacity, it can extract from the air about 4,000 tons of carbon every year. So obviously it's not being captured in trees, but you're just sucking the carbon out of the air. So it's not in the atmosphere, and it's going to reduce global warming. And there are lots and lots. These projects are called direct air capture technologies, and I'll come back to them again. But one of the reasons why businesses are investing in this is because we can only do so much with trees and everything else. And we need to start lots of things at the same time to make progress. And so this is a whole area. These guys recently, they raised $650 million from venture capital for the development of this. And their vision is that all over the world we'll have these air capture machines, thousands and tens of thousands of them, sucking the carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's going to help us deal with the problem of global warming. Now the problem is, once you've sucked the carbon out of the atmosphere, what do you do with it? Store it in your backyard? You have to transport it someplace and bury it permanently. And so there's this whole other business of the transport and storage of carbon as well, which is an extra cost. The Norwegians have been thinking about this for about 30 years. And they have put in place a system called Northern Lights. And so you see this map up here with the picture of Norway and those lines linking Germany and Ireland and the UK, etc. These are the trade routes where captured carbon will be brought by rail, by road, by boat, to places where it will then be pumped down underground, someplace where we can store the carbon forever. So abandoned oil fields, abandoned gas wells, etc. These are the kind of places that we're talking about. The infrastructure for this is enormous. And this map really is a recent map done by some scientists who work in this area, looking at where will we store the carbon around Europe, and what are the trade routes, wherever the carbon is captured, where will we bring it to store it, etc. So the point is that if you look at the alternatives for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, there are many different approaches to it, and they all have, placed different prices on carbon. And then there are the nature-based solutions, and this is where we operate. And in a sense, the nature-based solutions, they still have their costs, involved with it. The money is much, much smaller, but in general, the financial industry is not set up to provide these smaller amounts of money, until recently, anyway. And so you have the forests, you have the wild prairies, and even kelp forests. These are nature-based solutions for storing carbon. And up here, I mentioned this, it's a project in Madagascar called Grain de Vie, because about 10 years ago, I was working with the guy that I work with occasionally, and what he does is he helps his clients get rid of their, reduce their impact on the planet by sequestering carbon, by planting trees in Madagascar. And to plant a tree in Madagascar, at least at the time when we were working on this, it was 25 euro cents to plant a little sapling. And that corresponded to the equivalent in carbon as a 20-kilometer taxi ride in Brussels. And actually, we were working with some new venture-backed taxi startups, where one of the marketing campaigns of the taxi startup was that you could sequester, you could decarbonize your taxi ride by planting trees in Madagascar. Now, Madagascar is a long way away, but this was the cheapest carbon that you could get at the time. And also, it has a huge problem. The forests have been destroyed for growing vanilla and stuff like that. So Madagascar has a huge restoration problem to restore the forests and the biodiversity, etc., and the natural landscapes. And there are these NGOs doing it. And ultimately, by financing the NGOs, you finance a real carbon project that sequesters carbon and achieves other goals as well. And at the same time, you can tell a good story to your clients, your consumers, about the good things that you're doing to save the planet, etc., and reassure them that the product or the service they buy is a low carbon product, etc. And this kind of communication, having stories like that to tell, is really important for businesses that are taking a lead on carbon sequestration, because it allows them to explain via a good story, which is real, to their clients the good that they're doing, and provide them with incentives for continuing to buy the services, etc. Now, there's all kinds of carbon projects being done for the soil. The European Union has been promoting this, and you have businesses setting up that are intermediates between those that would buy carbon credits and, say, the farmers that would store carbon by implementing good practices. And typically, the food companies, for example, like Unilever, Danone, etc., they have all made a pledge to be carbon neutral by a certain date. But about 60 to 80% of their carbon footprint is with the farmers. So what they're doing now is they're writing to the farmers and tell them that we'll pay you a premium if you practice regenerative agriculture or something else. But this is just a compliance regime. So you get a little bit of extra money for being compliant. But there's no measure of performance. And at some moment we have to start measuring the performance. So this is like one of the elements in the room, is how to efficiently measure in a way that is credible and trustable, the actual carbon being sequestered in soils. And there's been a lot of greenwashing, especially with the forestry projects. And by some estimates, about 90% of these forest sequestration projects are a game. It's really been scandalous, the amount of trickery that's been going on. Supported by the finance industry, because they're really pushing hard. It's not because they're evil people, it's that they're just, maybe some of you think they are, maybe some of them are, but they don't do the due diligence, and as long as the law doesn't oblige them to act differently, they're not going to do it. But anyway, we need to move from compliance to performance. And the EU is playing its role. It's trying to do something on the carbon removal certification scheme. And we've been looking at this for a long time. The Forum 1000 initiative is one of the earliest projects. You might know about it. But anyway, I kind of wanted to end up here and talk about the economics of the carbon markets. Because if you look at the European trading system, to buy a carbon credit from the ETS carbon market, let's say it's about $100. Okay. So I have permission, I decarbonize, my emissions, my ton of emissions by paying $100 for the credit. Let's look at some of these direct air capture projects. When you look into the details, it's kind of amazing. Setting up the machine is somewhere between 10 and 15 million. This machine, one machine, captures about 4,000 tons a year, operating at full capacity. The cost of operation is somewhere between $500 and $600 a ton. So, and these are commercial businesses, so they have to sell the credit, at more than $600 a ton. They're breaking even at 600. They're asking for 800. And in some of the scenarios that the business people are running, they're going well over $1,000 a ton. This is much more expensive than the $100 in the emission trading scheme. And it's because people, the investors, are betting that there'll be a rush for credits at some point, and the cost of credits will go up and up. And at some point, the technology will provide the credits cheaper, maybe as low as $300 a ton. But the demand will be so much that they're going to make huge profits out of it. And the investors believe them to the point that VCs have put in $650 million into the Orca project. And this is the economics that they're putting forward. And then if we look at what's happening with these carbon platforms that are paying the farmers, for sequestering carbon, they're paying the farmers somewhere between $10 and $20 a ton. So what I'm saying is that there's great potential, in soil, carbon sequestration in the soils. We need to get around the greenwashing thing, and there are, ways of doing it. But look at the bigger picture, A credit under the ETS current was $10, it's now $100. It could be much more expensive in the future. The direct air capture projects that have been supported by venture capital, they are looking at $1,000 a ton. But they could be making ridiculous amounts of money already at $400 a ton. That's what they're hoping to be able to do. But all the farmers are getting right now is like $10 or $20. And so it's the difference between the cost of capture, and then you have an intermediate platform, and then you have somebody who's selling it into what are called the voluntary carbon markets. And a lot of the cost is the verification and trust, monitoring, reporting, and verification. Now, there is research being done to bring the cost down. It must be brought down significantly so that it's sufficiently done for the farmers. But the solution is through area-based strategies using satellite data and combining data with artificial intelligence, etc. So there are lots and lots of solutions being worked on. But what I'm saying is that unless you pay attention to the economics of carbon sequestration in the soil, all of the profits are going to be captured by somebody else, and we'll have exactly the same diagram as we had with the beef. So this in your try to bring into your sphere, into your thinking in the future, the kind of economists that are thinking about the markets and stand back, and look at all of the stuff that's going on in carbon, because exactly the same kind of arguments and the same phenomenon will unfold with respect to water and with respect to biodiversity. And again, I just want to remind that we keep talking about the farmers. One of the big issues now is, okay, we set aside 20% of the land of Europe as some kind of a nature reserve. Who's going to pay for this? You have to put up signs, you have maps, you have to control the tourism or try to make money out of it in other ways. You have to police it and make sure that the barriers are respected, etc. But all of that costs money, even if it is modest amounts of money. And the hope is that the sale of credits or allowances in biodiversity, conservation credits, and also carbon credits, etc., that it's the sale of those kind of things, that using carbon farming through the management of nature reserves, that it will be possible to pay for what needs to be done, and hopefully generate an excess of credits that could be used to decarbonize agriculture or maybe decarbonize other parts of the economy and generate revenues for rural areas. Now, among the solutions, I'm going to end up because I'm out of time now, but just want to mention that I said that there are solutions to the beef problem. I did a lot of work on cooperatives back in the old days, and I found wonderful examples of hybrid cooperatives where you have commercial companies like farmers operating under the traditional capitalist, closely owned business model. And what they do is they set up on a cooperative basis distribution and sales. That can be terribly successful. And when it is, it provides an outlet for the farmers where they get paid the price they want. And if it's run successfully, they also get dividends every year, from the extra earnings. And so this thing in the middle called Land Winkel, this is a network of shops in the Netherlands, which is very well run, entirely owned by the farmers. The farmers get a very good price for what they produce, and they also get the dividends from the successful running of the shops at the end of the day. And that has totally transformed the economy of farming. But there are many, many models like that. Usually, operating these models, there is legislation that stands in the way. And recently, looking at the circular economy issues, we were told that in Austria, in 1 year, they set up more than 1,000 energy communities. In other words, energy cooperatives that were citizen-owned. 1,000 in 1 year. That's the pace of change that we need. But in most countries in Europe, nothing is happening because it's being blocked by legislation. So just to underline the role of, legislation and governance, etc., in enabling the successful business models. And the last thing is new forms of investment. Impact funding, hybrid finance, that the EIB is behind. Green bonds that I mentioned before. Things called opportunity funds. There are all kinds of very interesting, innovative financial models that are emerging now, which can finance the type of projects that are needed to support green carbon farming, etc., in ways that would be of benefit to farmers and rural communities. Anyway, this is just a summary. We're living in an age of disruption. All the farms need to decarbonize. They cannot be considered different or special. All industry has to decarbonize. That includes the farms. Already this has started because the food companies need to decarbonize. They've made public pledges. Their shareholders are after them. Their employees are after them. Somebody has to pay for biodiversity. So these are the big pressures, that are creating pressure and demand for carbon sequestration. We need to deal with the prosperity challenge. Ultimately, it's a food security issue. Unless farmers earn well and rural economies earn well, we won't have food security. And then look at the wide range of mechanisms that make up the carbon economy, and look at how does the rural areas and farming and carbon farming fit into that. Carbon farming cannot just be to produce more food at a lower price and make everybody feel good except the farmer who doesn't get paid again. But there are, mechanisms, enabling mechanisms in terms of these new hybrid economy models, mixing capitalist and cooperative principles, and all of these new types of finance, etc. So my feeling is that all of the ingredients are there, but we need to be watchful and we need to be purposeful in making sure that whatever comes out of our efforts in developing the soil mission and the soil economy, in addition to the soil science, we need to pay attention to finance and governance and economic models. And if we do that, I think we have a real opportunity to totally reinvent farming and rural communities, and it's about time. So, thank you.
Do you have time for questions?
Yeah, of course, yeah. At least I think I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for an incredibly encompassing lecture. If I have time for all the comments and questions I have, you will need another hour. So, indeed, it was very fascinating. But I would like to make one comment and one kind of crazy idea. We'll see how we play. Comment is about acid rain. I did my PhD in acid rain, so therefore I did my PhD in acid rain back in 1980 when President Ronald Reagan gave a lot of money to this. The problem with acid rain, it was not solved. The sulfate went down. Nitrate stayed fairly high and causing eutrophication here in Europe, North America. Furthermore, in China, acid rain now attacking mine spoilers and release heavy metals into the rivers and groundwater. An issue that nobody in the Western world back then in the 80s, when acid rain attacked Washington Monument, that's why Reagan gave the money. So acid rain, as the problem didn't go away, it just took a third after climate change, ozone in the stratosphere, it became a third issue. It does exist. Now, so that's just a comment. Now into almost a philosophical idea. You talk about rural issues. And environment, that farmers living the rural areas and they go to cities or whatever, and then there is the issue of food safety. And then you talk about the beef industry. How about humanity change their diets and become vegetarian, at least partially? The beef industry is a very cruel industry. Everybody that eats steaks, all the people around me, they don't think about how the animal were butchered in order to get the steak. So then you can create a whole new industry. I'm not talking about synthetic meat, it's also a possibility, but slowly but surely replacing the diets, I don't know if it's feasible, to more vegetarian, I'm not talking vegan, which is extreme, less beef issues, and then you can go back, which an idea I didn't know about it, that Europe, there is a certain need to increase the wilderness in Europe. So you can give up certain places that you need for the beef and make it forest or whatever. I know it's kind of wild and I don't know how it's getting done. And one final comment, which you didn't have to answer, coming from Israel, it's really ridiculous to say, how about humanity stop spending so much on military? And you have so much money for other things. Okay, but that's of course.
Okay, no, great. Well, first on the acid rain, you're absolutely right. I mean, and this is the danger of trying to do things quickly and oversimplify. These problems are always far more complex, and bigger than we present them. But generally, the cap and trade approach is considered successful in policy circles. Though it's true, the eutrophication, etc. I mean, we really suffered from that in Ireland. But anyway, that's a conversation for another time. And I would collect it more with the water, with the water issue. On the beef, the last time I was working with the national government on this, they were protecting beef in the dairy industry. And I asked them, I said, how many people have reduced their consumption of beef? I said, everybody in the room. They had reduced their consumption of red meat for health reasons. Mainly for health reasons, and an increasing number of people under the influence of their kids, for the planetary reasons. And we have these movements called climatarianism, etc. But what's happening is, around the world, as societies get more prosperous, one of the things they do is they increase their consumption of beef. And beef is also, so this is something that's very difficult, especially with the colonial class, to come along and wag the finger at people and say, don't eat beef, don't have babies, don't take the airplane. This is something we really have to struggle with the ethics on that. But beef is connected with dairy production as well. And although the industries have looked for plant-based substitutes, a lot of those substitutes are worse for your health than the milk, actually. What's your blood glycemic index and stuff like that? There's been a huge amount of greenwashing going on as well. So again, these are not simple, issues. They're usually far more complex. And you might think you've found a champion, for a while because they've spent a lot in marketing. But it's actually much more complex than that. And if we want a milk substitute, for young people growing up, healthy bones, etc., cow's milk is still not bad, and the plant substitutes are not a nutritional supplement for that. And again, are we going to put all of those farmers out of work? I mean, we're in a situation, the madness in Ireland, I've done a lot of work in Ireland, and I'm Irish, so I can talk about their madness, but I know well. The government has a position, and then the Department of Agriculture has an opposed position. The National Institute for Outreach to the farmers, telling them what to do and how to do it, says, promise them, we'll help you double your milk output to become more profitable. And the same year, the national government says, no, you have to have your milk output. And then in the press, they were discussing getting the Irish Army out to cull 1.3 million cows, to shoot the cows. Because we're fairly pacifist, we do peacekeeping, we don't go to war, so let's go and shoot some cows. but this is not a joke. If you read this, you wonder, is this Monty Python? What world are we living in? Just last week, there was a case of a farmer earning money, and for some reason, the army was contracted to go out and shoot the cows on his land. So I'm looking, I had to check this. I said, this has to be, false news. No, it's not. So I'm kind of looking into this, knowing, what madness happened to allow this. So it's just to say that things are kind of chaos right now. Everybody kind of knows we have to do something, but they're running around, not really sure what to do, and there's so much disinformation, and there's so much disempowerment at the appropriate level of government as well. And this is why, my message always is, for those who work in local government, take charge of it. Know your values and your principles, know what kind of a world you want to live in the future, and then try to push through the policies and the initiatives to make it happen. And even if they're small scale, the models, like the cooperative models from Israel, we know a lot about the cooperative model, and it's a constantly evolving, very, very interesting phenomenon that sits beside capitalism in a kind of a hybrid format nowadays. And then you have all of these innovations in finance. And I think that we do have the ingredients, to come out of this in a better position. But it's not going to be easy. We're going to have to do a lot of work and think very hard to come up with the right formula. So,
okay.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Patrick, very much for your interesting... there's another question, sorry.
Well, thanks a lot for you are a great communicator. Very interesting. It is under discussion at EU level, at Commission level, new regulation to set a common frame for carbon sequestration, removal certification.
Yes.
And that includes all types of carbon removal. One of its carbon farming.
Sure.
And we, at the Ministry of Agriculture, we wonder if it will be competitive enough, especially in the southern country, and especially for mineral soils. We don't have proper organic soil to compete with, other kinds of carbon farming, and especially with forestry and with industrial sequestration. Yeah. So is it really going to be a profitable business for the farmers?
Well, this is a fascinating question, and just like several years ago, I was fielding phone calls from former clients in Ireland. And they were very interested in the idea of setting up a carbon cooperative to decarbonize dairy, because everybody treats dairy like criminals. They're not criminals, and they sequester carbon. And all anybody talks about is the emission. But if you go to sheep farmers in Australia, these are ruminants that eat methane, etc. But in many cases, there is a negative sequestration of carbon in these areas, despite the presence of the sheep. So 2 years ago, we had, no, 3 years ago, we had elections, general elections, and prior in Ireland, and prior to the elections, there was a discussion among the farmers. The young farmers wanted to measure their carbon. So you can decarbonize the farm, by having electric tractors, there's all kinds of stuff that needs to be done, and soil is only one part of that. So I think the big issue is to decarbonize the farm. If you can do that, you have a fantastic story to tell the food industry and consumers, etc. And it's great material for marketing, because it's real, it's authentic, etc. And if you can stand up with verifiable numbers, etc. This is a great story. The most innovative food producers are already starting to tell those stories. But I'm not aware of any country, that is really, going down that road. But I think that there is always hope there's something that can be done. And the difficulty of the European legislation is that it tries to be all things to everybody. And of course, you have all of the vested interests, weighing in. And the good legislation with respect to biodiversity and the natural environment, we almost didn't get it through. Even von der Leyen's cabinet, had deserted her a week ago. And a lot of us were very worried. I'm a member of the Club of Rome, and these are the things we're discussing, But I think that you need to step back first, decarbonize farming. And there's a lot that can be done with that, and there are the big agricultural sectors, maybe could take the lead. You could do it on a farm-by-farm basis if the farms are big enough, or you could do it collectively on a regional basis. And I think you really need to get into the numbers, and to really decide what the best options are. But I'm generally very, very, optimistic that the solutions are there, but we need to take the time and the care to think through the options.